What if the world's strongest alliance wasn't as solid as it looks? Imagine waking up to find out that the United States, Britain's closest ally for decades, might be reconsidering its support over a historic territorial dispute, not because of war between them, but because of a completely different conflict unfolding. That's exactly the situation unfolding now. A quiet but explosive development has emerged from inside the Pentagon, suggesting that long-standing loyalties may no longer be guaranteed. At the center of it all is a remote group of islands in the South Atlantic, seemingly insignificant yet suddenly pulled into the heart of a global. But this isn't just about geography, it's about power, pressure, and a growing divide between nations that once stood shoulder to shoulder. As tensions rise over a controversial war in Iran, decisions are being made behind closed doors. Decisions that could reshape alliances that have existed for generations. And what's being hinted at isn't just disagreement, but it's something much deeper, something that raises a difficult question. What happens when allies start turning on each other? To understand why this leak even exists, you have to look at the conflict that set everything in motion. The US-led military action against Iran. Unlike previous operations where allies were brought in early and presented with a unified strategy, this time things played out very differently. The United States moved forward with far less consultation, catching several allies off guard. Countries like the United Kingdom and Spain were suddenly faced with a decision: fully commit to a war they hadn't helped shape, or hold back and risk damaging their relationship with Washington. Many chose caution, expressing concern over legality, escalation, and long-term consequences. But in Washington, that hesitation wasn't interpreted as careful diplomacy, it was seen as a lack of loyalty. The narrative quickly shifted. American officials began suggesting that their allies had benefited from US protection for decades while contributing less in return. That frustration didn't just stay behind closed doors, it started to influence policy discussions. And as the war dragged on without a clear resolution, that sense of imbalance only grew stronger, setting the stage for tensions that would soon spill into the open. What followed wasn't subtle. The tone coming out of Washington began to change, and it became clear that this wasn't just about one disagreement. Senior figures started openly questioning whether traditional allies were holding up their end of the bargain. Statements emphasized that alliances should be built on mutual contribution, not what some described as one-sided dependence. Spain, in particular, found itself under pressure after voicing strong criticism of the Iran conflict. There were even suggestions circulating that its position within NATO could be reconsidered if it continued to oppose US strategy. That kind of rhetoric marked a significant shift from the usual diplomatic language. It signaled that the United States was willing to use its influence not just to lead but to pressure. For many observers, this raised uncomfortable questions about the future of long-standing alliances. If disagreement could lead to threats or consequences, then the foundation of cooperation itself might be changing. And while several countries were feeling the heat, the United Kingdom, so often considered America's closest partner, suddenly found itself facing an unexpected and deeply sensitive challenge. The mention of the Falkland Islands brought an entirely different level of gravity to the situation. This wasn't just a political talking point, it was tied to a deeply emotional and historical conflict known as the Falklands War. Back in 1982, Argentina launched an invasion of the islands, leading to a brief but intense war with the United Kingdom. Hundreds of lives were lost before British forces regained control, and ever since, the islands have remained a symbol of sovereignty and sacrifice for the UK. The people living there have repeatedly expressed their desire to remain under British governance, making the issue not just strategic but personal. So when the idea emerged that the United States might reconsider its support, even hypothetically, it struck a nerve. British officials were quick to respond, reaffirming their commitment to the islands and dismissing any suggestion that sovereignty was up for discussion. But the very fact that such an option had been entertained raised serious concerns, because it suggested that even the most established positions could be leveraged under pressure, revealing just how much the geopolitical landscape might be shifting. As the situation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern. The traditional sense of unity within the Western alliance was beginning to show visible strain. For years, cooperation had been built on shared interests, mutual respect, and a sense of collective responsibility. But now those principles were being tested. The decision by the United States to move forward with military action without full allied backing created a ripple effect, leading to disagreements not just about strategy, but about process and trust. European nations began to question whether their voices were still being heard in decisions that could impact global stability. At the same time, the US appeared less willing to tolerate dissent, expecting alignment even when concerns were raised. This growing disconnect started to erode confidence on both sides. What was once seen as a stable and predictable partnership now felt uncertain, with each new development adding to the tension. And as these cracks widened, it became harder to ignore the possibility that the alliance itself might be entering a period of transformation. Amid rising tensions, attention turned to efforts aimed at preventing the situation from escalating further. New diplomatic talks were scheduled to take place in Pakistan, bringing together US representatives and Iranian officials in an attempt to find common ground. This time, the United States chose chose to send Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, signaling a cautious approach. Notably absent were some of the highest-ranking figures, suggesting that expectations for a breakthrough were being carefully managed. Previous rounds of negotiations had ended without success, and there was little indication that the core disagreements had been resolved. Key issues, including regional influence and nuclear capabilities, remained major obstacles. The decision to proceed with talks, however, indicated that both sides recognized the risks of continued escalation. Even so, the atmosphere surrounding these discussions was one of uncertainty. There was hope for progress, but also an awareness that failure could lead to further instability. And while these diplomatic efforts were unfolding, events elsewhere were already adding new layers of complexity to the situation. While global attention focused on Iran and diplomatic negotiations, the broader region was experiencing its own escalation. In southern Lebanon, tensions reignited as conflict between Israeli forces and Hezbollah intensified once again. Airstrikes, drone activity, and retaliatory attacks became increasingly frequent, despite ongoing claims of a ceasefire. For civilians living in these, the situation was devastating. Many had already been displaced multiple times, forced to leave their homes in search of safety, only to find themselves in danger once again. Infrastructure continued to suffer damage, and the sense of remained fragile at best. What made this particularly concerning was how interconnected these al-ahdath were becoming. The conflict was no longer isolated. It was a wider of instability stretching across the region. Each development added pressure to an already volatile situation, increasing the risk of further escalation. And as multiple fronts remained active, the possibility of containing the conflict became increasingly uncertain, leaving observers to wonder how far it might spread.